This book is absolutely bonkers. So when I started this channel, I guess I was like any other person who starts a YouTube channel, and especially BookTube. In your head, you'll have a type of book that you'd like to focus on, or you may have one or two already under your belt that you could talk about. And I was the same. And I thought, well, I'm going to be talking like philosophy, history, the esoteric, novels, plays, whatever. And it's developed, obviously, very quickly in the 5 or so months I've been doing this. But I never thought I'd be covering the likes of this. Alice's Adventures in Wonderland? No way! I tried to read it to my daughter in the 1990s and we both gave up. I was reading something about, if I remember, the Mock Turtle. And I looked down at her thinking she was enjoying it. And I noticed she was looking up at me. And we looked at each other and thought, yeah, okay, let's put this to one side. But that book didn't show Alice like this. This is Helen Oxenbury, who won an award for really updating the story with modern artwork. And it is superb, very memorable artwork. This picture right at the end is to do with, if you know the story, a trial. And afterwards, suddenly all the things in the trial blow up against Alice. And we're flung out of this world back to where it began, where Alice, and I believe it's her sister, are like lying dreaming on the side or somewhere in the countryside. But up until that moment, 98% of the story, I didn't get it. I thought, oh, perhaps the reason I put this down before, perhaps I shouldn't be talking about this to camera. I don't get it. It's like, yes, okay, there's things here that may have deep meaning. And there's a lot of people, as it turns out, who have studied the stories really, because they're through the looking glass, and said there's a lot of philosophy there and ideas. And I would say that's where I was going. I was thinking, oh, there's some things here that I could talk about. And especially the use, or the literal use of words, the surface level meaning of words. And I thought I was going to be talking about that. But it was only at the end it all came clear. And suddenly, this admittedly famous child's story took on a whole different meaning and weight. And I thought, wow, no wonder then it's lasted the test of time. No wonder it's beloved. Because you've got to read it all the way through to the very end to make sense of what you've just read. And then there's this beautiful little finale that it's really the author now talking about events. And you think, yes, wonderful. And again, I'll come to that at the end. It's amazing how much of the story has seeped into the consciousness of the general public. You only have to mention the Mad Hatter, Down the Rabbit Hole, the hookah-smoking caterpillar, and I am using the lyrics from White Rabbit by Jefferson Airplane. Fantastic song. The way she looks has just become so well known to the general public, and I knew them, but I didn't know the story, didn't know what it was about. Why was this thing written? So there's that. So much of it, when you read it, you think, oh, have I read this before? The actual references in modern day culture to this book are profound. So there's that. The second one is when I was reading it, I thought a couple of things. It was originally written, and that's a very good question, I don't know the answer. When was it originally written? 1865 by Lewis Carroll, who was a mathematics don at the University of Oxford. Very clever man. There's a piece in The White Rabbit by Jefferson Airplane. It talks about proportion of all drops sloppy dead. So a lot of this, of the adventure, is possibly because Lewis Carroll was trying to show the rigidity of the modern world compared to the fact that, is that really real? I've often thought that. Is he trying to say that how it's taught to people, this rigid set of maths isn't actually real. Because if you think about it, we're taught at school that 1 + 1 = 2, but 1 + 1 can equal 1. One piece of clay, you add it together and you've got one piece of clay. Yes, the scale and proportion have changed, but the actual 1 + 1. So there's some illogicity, unlogicalness. It's that premise that I think a lot of this is to do with. And he was a mathematician, so he had this rigid sense of the world. Or he taught the rigid sense of the world. This book, who is it aimed for? It's aimed for children. But when it was written, yes, there were books that were written for children. But there really wasn't any young adult literature that we now have. And also genre. So genre is ancient. I think Aristotle talked about it in the Poetics, the idea of the structure of different types of literature, poetics, hymns, and that kind of stuff. Genre, the French word, is new, relatively new in history. And we've come to say this must therefore be young adult because of the way it's written, but I don't think this is for children, the level of language. There's also a lot of themes here that aren't for children, but it would be put under the young adult literature section potentially, or fantasy. But could you imagine if it had never been written? Hard to fathom that in this modern world, but imagine it had not been written. And then Lewis Carroll comes along in the year 2025, he writes it, and he submits it to an agent. I wonder if an agent would accept it, or whether it would ever be published. So back in 1865, when it was published, different world. All right, so what's it about? You come across some bizarre characters. The Duchess, there is Alice, and that's the Queen. Off with their heads! Which nobody, as we find out from the King, that never happens. It's just her going off on one. Or is there something more to it? And you come across these bizarre scenes in which they're trying to play croquet with the flamingos, and Alice's flamingo won't behave, and the balls are hedgehogs. It's just, wow. Okay. There are some verses and songs in the book which personally I've studied. Personally? 2 instances, they break the flow of the story. And there's one bit that's just an insert that makes no sense to the rest of the story, and the story makes no sense in itself anyway, so that's bizarre to say. This was written by Lewis Carroll. Anon, to sudden silence won, in fancy they pursue, the dream child moving through a land of wonders wild and new, in friendly chat with bird or beast, and half believe it true. I think there's a forewarning there that what you're about to read, if you've never read it before, is Alice in this bizarre world of different size and proportion, and the ways in which she can grow and go small. She finds out, well, it's either something she's drunk or a mushroom. You know, if she eats it slowly, she can grow by proportion. She's going to meet anthropomorphized animals that talk her language and English, the very English, these characters. And I say that deliberately, I don't say British, they're very English. And it's about Alice, and I think that's her sister. At first I thought it was her mother, but I think it's her sister. Yeah, sister. But her sister sat still. So Alice is she's pictured under this tree with her sister. Her sister's reading a book, and Alice is warm and lethargic, and she drifts off. Now, the key to understanding this, and there will be spoilers, so if you've not read this and you want to find out for yourself, please don't listen further. But if you've read it or you're interested, carry on. You know the way it goes. When you're asleep, you don't fully shut off the world because you're still hearing. And what you hear outside, if you're like in that deep, well, there's different levels of sleepness, aren't there? There's different levels of consciousness. But if you're residing at that level where you're not waking up, but your mind is hearing stuff outside like a dog bark, suddenly you may start imagining, I wouldn't necessarily say a dog, but you will start potentially coming across an animal in your dream or something like that. And that is the case with Alice. And she suddenly comes across this white rabbit. who is late. And we find out why he's late later. What's interesting is the anthropomorphication. I'm making words up now, aren't I? The way in which the animals are made human, but of the era. So the white rabbit has a fob watch and is wearing a little waistcoat, or certainly that's the way he's pictured it. It's waistcoat pocket, yeah, that's right. So it's 1865. You've got to imagine that the clothes that they were wearing in that era informs the clothes what the animals are wearing. And Alice follows the rabbit, obviously, and falls down the hole. And New Zealand is mentioned. It says here, I wonder if I shall fall right through the earth. This is while she's falling. How funny it all seemed to come out among the people that walk with their heads downwards. That's us here in New Zealand. The antipathies. It's obviously the antipodes, which is mixing up words. And then she imagines she's having this conversation and says, please, Ma'am, is this New Zealand or Australia? And I'm glad that New Zealand came first. Sorry, Oz. And we did invent the pavlova. The language of the story is quite interesting. This is a child, Alice, and we're seeing it through her point of view. A lot of the mix-ups and the confusion she has is to do with words. We've already seen that with antipathies. That's the wrong word. She says, do cats eat bats? And sometimes do bats eat cats? For you see, as she couldn't answer either question, it didn't much matter which way she put it. This is where we run the risk of reading far too much into it, because my first instinct would be to talk about the philosophy of language. That if you're asking a question but you don't know what you're talking about, then there's no point to the question. It's a language game. I'm thinking about Ludwig Wittgenstein and his 2 books, and how we use or misabuse logic, and also what is real. So very early on, when Alice falls down into the rabbit hole and she comes across this table, she's not surprised in a way when she starts to grow small and then starts growing large. So many out-of-the-way things had happened lately that Alice had begun to think that very few things were really impossible. If you live in a staid world where very few unusual things happen, your perception of what is possible is completely different, even almost remote to the point of a nothingness, than somebody who's living in a world where things are happening all the time, bizarre things. I mean, they say that one of the great things of travel is that you're forced to come across stuff you don't normally confront in your everyday life, and that opens up the mind. You're forced to become curious because you've not seen this thing before. But if you ever find yourself or others have never left where they live, they don't travel, they're not curious, that's difficult. It's almost impossible for some people to break out of that. But there is almost some like Zen-like quality to the language, bizarre references. So, for instance, she tried to fancy what the flame of a candle is like after it is blown out. It's like, what's the sound of one hand clapping? It's like, I think it's in the Upanishads, where the boy talking to the master says, how did this tree grow? And the master said, well, from nothing. He said, well, how is that possible? And he says, look at the tree, and he takes down a seed, imagine it's like an acorn, and he gives it to the boy and said, break that open. He said, yeah. He said, well, that seed came from the tree. What's inside the outer shell? And she said, well, there's a little nut. I said, yes, okay, well, break that nut, and what's in the nut? Nothing. Nothing's there. And the master says, yeah, from that nothing comes this tree. And it's almost similar to that. It's getting the mind to focus on the bizarre, and why do we impose a false sense of nature on nature, so to speak. I mean, we are human animals, aren't we not? And we're, in a way, blessed with this ability to make sense of the world, make sense of the chaos by imposing our will upon nature. So if you look at a beautiful landscape with a like a side of a hill, what mankind will do is they'll level parts of that, either for a tunnel or for a road, a straight road, as much as possible to go along it, which is unnatural. We impose these straight edges on an unstraight natural world. We rank, we tier things because we want to make sense of what is really nonsensical, if you think about it. It's why we rank books and tier. But what if that never happened? The world would seem chaotic. And this is what Alice starts to do. As the story unfolds, she begins to impose her will more forcefully on the world to try and make sense of it. And towards the end, the character changes. I'm going to make a note of that shortly. Out of the flow of the story, there'll be these little sentences like, "Curiouser and curiouser," cried Alice. For the moment, she quite forgot how to speak good English. Was I the same when I got up this morning? I almost think I can remember feeling a little different. But if I'm not the same, the next question is, who in the world am I? Wonderful. And that's quite deep. And I'm trying to think whether my daughter, when I told her this story, like a lot of children her age, she would have been about 3. You're not going to get that. So, these animals. And you know, when I was starting to read through it, I couldn't help thinking that what Lewis Carroll does is hold up a mirror, like all good authors do, to the society that he was living in and says, look at this is what we're like. But rather than criticising, say, royalty directly, it would have been Queen Victoria then, you got a mad queen who no one listens to and is always giving some kind of aggressive, off with their heads, and then moving on. It's like a bad teacher who in an unruly class would say, shh, and then move on and completely not enforce that rule so the kids don't end up listening to her in the end. And this world in which she finds herself is very chaotic, and there are strange creatures with human-like emotions. So they're representing us, in a way. There's this wonderful piece where the animals, they're all wet and they're all running around. It's, I think, a critique of meetings that you could say is as relevant today as it was written in 1865. In that case, said the dodo, solemnly rising to its feet, I move that the meeting adjourn for the immediate adoption of more energetic remedies. Speak English, said the eaglet. I don't know the meaning of half those long words, and what's more, I don't believe you do either. I've been in meetings where secretly we did bingo. How many convoluted, preposterous use of languages and phrases can you come across? Are we going to hear blue sky thinking in the meeting today? Tick. But it's this literal use of language. So there's the mouse. And the mouse, as you can see, has a very long tail. The mouse is trying to tell a story and says, mine is a long and sad tale, said the mouse, turning to Alice and sighing. It's a long tail, certainly, said Alice, looking down with wonder at the mouse's tail. You get a lot of this in Shakespeare, especially in, I would say, the early plays, where I think it's Launce in Two Gentlemen of Verona. He gets the word tide, which is the tide coming in of the sea, but assumes that what's being said is you're being tied up in knots, and it's just this flow of a mix-up of words and language, which, unless you're into language, is going to leave you cold. So, when you read this, the surface level is, I don't think, what is intended. It's what lies below this story. Because on the surface level, it's just animals talking and Alice confronting them. And in these bizarre and increasingly bizarre situations. But I think there's more to it than that. Alice says she grew no larger in a house she was. It's rather curious, you know, this sort of life. I do wonder what can have happened to me. When I used to read fairy tales, I fancied that kind of thing never happened. And now here I am in the middle of one. There ought to be a book written about me, that there ought, and when I grow up, I'll write one. But I'm grown up now. Oh, you foolish Alice, she answered herself. How can you learn lessons in here? Why, there's hardly room for you, and no room at all for any lesson books. She was too big for that rabbit house. If you look at it on the surface level, that's her size. she's too big. But I don't think it's talking necessarily just about the size. It's here. She became too big to learn any more lessons there. She had to move on. She had to flee the nest, so to speak. And it goes on and on. Alice is an innocent, but everywhere she goes, she sows confusion. She's trying to impose slowly her will on the world in which she finds herself. Food and drink is definitely a theme. I suppose I ought to eat or drink something or other, but the question is, what? Again, reading far too much into it that's for the good of the story myself. Lewis Carroll was in increasingly an era of teetotalism. This is an example of stuff that comes in and breaks the flow of the story. I'm not sure what it has to do with anything. I think Lewis Carroll had these things and he's just going to put them into the book. And then there's obviously questions here to do with logic. Talking about a mushroom, Alice remained looking thoughtfully at the mushroom for a minute. And this is a giant mushroom, it's bigger than a house. Trying to make out which were the two sides of it. And as it was perfectly round, she found this a very difficult question. That's definitely a mathematician talking there. There's definitely making fun at, I would say, and this is very much like Dickens, or even Jane Austen. So you think about Jane Austen, the little I know, and I'm going on what my wife and daughter have told me, nearly every story that Jane Austen wrote pokes fun at curates, priests. Dickens does something very similar with the pomposity of lawyers because his father was put in debtor's prison for a long time. And I think Lewis Carroll is doing the same here. They both bowed low and their curls got entangled together. It's poking fun at Victorian society. But when you get to this point, it's about halfway through the story, it suddenly takes a very dark turn. And this is where I started to get confused and think, oh dear, what's this guy taking? So you get a baby that's a pig, and then there's a chef or a cook who's throwing stuff at them. It's just really dark. And it's only at the end that I kind of get why that is. You meet the Cheshire Cat. You get a very mad scene where this Duchess is throwing the baby up. And Alice is worried. There's definitely, or it seems to me, and again, I stand to be corrected here. I may be trying to read far too much into it. There's Taoism. It's quite a long bit. It's the Cheshire Cat. Cheshire Puss, she began rather timidly, as she did not know at all whether it would like the name. However, it only grinned a little wider. Come, it's pleased so far, thought Alice, and she went on. Would you tell me, please, which way I ought to go from here? That depends a good deal on where you want to get to, said the cat. I don't much care where, said Alice. Then it doesn't matter which way you go, said the cat. So long as I get somewhere, Alice added as an explanation. That's Taoism to a T. Go with the flow. And again, this madness, this continual bizarreness of the world is mentioned by Lewis Carroll here. But I don't want to go among mad people, Alice remarked. Oh, you can't help that, said the cat. We're all mad here. I'm mad, you're mad. How do you know I'm mad, said Alice. You must be, or you wouldn't have come here. That is the basis of a lot of 1960s British humour. Monty Python, or the Goons. Platonism. Well, I've often seen a cat without a grin, thought Alice, but a grin without a cat? It's the most curious thing I ever saw in all my life. I instantly thought Platonism. I thought, hang on, am I reading too much into it? So I looked it up online, and people think the same. That there is some kind of almost idealism being mentioned throughout the book. And that's understandable when you consider that the mathematician would think that way. At the Mad Hatter's Tea Party, which really isn't that mad, I was confounded by this. He's got hats on his head because he's got no room to hold his hats. He has argued with time, and time has forced a stop on time, so they can never leave, really. This tea party can't end. And they have to eat and they drink, but then they've got nowhere to put the plate, so they have to keep shuffling around. That's not as mad as I thought it was going to be. And what they're talking about, for me, makes sense. I'm surprised that people have come to see this as like a lunatic. He's not. but there is a play with language. You might as well say that I see what I eat is the same as I eat what I see. You might just as well say, added the March Hare, that I like what I get is the same thing as I get what I like. That I breathe when I sleep when I breathe. And it's just this continual playing on words and malapropisms, and yeah, it's very... I don't quite know what to make of it. Alice felt dreadfully puzzled. The Hatter's remark seemed to have no meaning in it, and yet it was certainly English. I don't quite understand, she said, as politely as she could. Riddles with no answers. And in a way, if we live in a world in which we think we can make sense of everything and there is an answer for everything, that is difficult to accept, because there are no answers. It's just what we think are answers. We think we know. At this point, Alice's personality changes. She becomes quite cutting, 2 or 3 places. Nobody asked your opinion, said Alice. And as she goes beyond the tea party, and she ends up going to meet the Mad Queen, she starts to impose her will on the story. She comes into the Queen's garden, and I'm not going to talk too much about that, apart from I think it's talking about hierarchy. You meet these cards, they're a lowly position, there's a knave who's been falsely accused that has to go to trial. You meet the absolute bizarreness of the way things are run in this world, the arbitrariness of the Queen and her appalling leadership style. Who's very aggressive, and if you dare to argue against her, she will abuse her authority, and doesn't that say a lot? I would throw this to a bad manager and get them to read it if I could. And it goes on, but not too quickly, because you get to the point where a definite critique of the English law courts. It's this thing right at the end, in which the lunacy of a court and the people in charge, the king's in charge, and he keeps wanting to wrap up because he's bored, and find someone guilty even though there's no evidence, and so on. And after all that, if you hadn't given up like I had before, you might think, what was this all about? And then I got really disappointed. The most disappointed I've ever been in a long time. And if I'd have finished at this point, I would not have got this book at all. I'm trying to find it. "Wake up, Alice dear," said her sister. "Why, what a long sleep you've had." Before I started my degree, I had to go to night school to get up to speed. It was called an access course, and I was sitting in a room with 15-year-olds. And I was in my 30s, I had 2 children. And we did a thing on creative writing. Actually, it was very useful in later life. And the woman said, right, you're going to write a story, but you're not allowed to say it's all a dream. No. So when I thought, it's all a dream, I thought, oh my, that's terrible. This is appalling. I want my money back. But I knew there was only 4 paragraphs to carry on, to read. So I read it, and I'm so glad I did. And this is where I'm going to end up. I'm actually going to read it. Alice wakes up, and she goes off. And her sister has heard Alice recount the tale of what she's been through. And obviously the sister, the older sister, is thinking things through. Think, oh, right. She believes she went down a rabbit hole and there was a baby pig. All this deck of cards suddenly in a wind blew against her. How could this be? So she sat on with closed eyes and half believed herself in Wonderland, though she knew she had but to open them again and all would change to dull reality. The grass would be only rustling in the wind, and the pool rippling to the waving of the reeds. The rattling teacups would change to the tinkling sheep bells, and the Queen's shrill cries to the voice of the shepherd boy, and the sneeze of the baby, the shriek of the griffin, and all the other queer noises would change, she knew, to the confused clamour of the busy farmyard, while the lowing of the cattle in the distance would take the place of the mock turtle's heavy sobs. All of this was a young girl falling asleep and yet listening to the sounds around her, and it made this jumble, this mad jumble of this world. That elevated it slightly. It's the last paragraph, I think, that makes this great. Lastly, she pictured to herself how the same little sisters of hers would, in the after-time, be herself a grown woman, and how she would keep through all her riper years the simple and loving heart of her childhood, and how she would gather about her other little children, and make their eyes bright and eager with many a strange tale, perhaps even with the dream of Wonderland of long ago, and how she would feel with all their simple sorrows and find a pleasure in all their simple joys, remembering her own child life and the happy summer days. Is it possible that one paragraph could alter the whole of a book? I think there's a tale I've got to remind myself here. I was so tempted to DNF, and although it has happened before, it doesn't serve a purpose. And there is an argument, why wait so long just to make it obvious at the end? If at the end you get that powerful sudden turn, that twist, you're not going to get it if you stop. Not every book is going to be like that, absolutely. I was determined to find out or ask myself, why is this so well liked? Now, I don't know if it's that final paragraph, but for myself, it makes it something of a wonder, Wonderland. That we live in a world in which we are beset by outside noises and energy and feelings and stuff, and it will work on our inner mind. But how sad would it be that as children we abandon that and never revisit? That we lose our sense of being childlike, not childish, childlike. Alice, this was written in 1865, she would have been an old woman by the First World War, and she was possibly not going to look back fondly upon those childlike memories. Perhaps she would have. But to also then get other children to be exposed to that weirdness, because we live in a world that's false. We've made it this world, but it's not the real world. It's not. Most of the stuff we come across is not natural. We've made it seem natural because it suits ourselves. The ergonomics of our shape and size and what we need to do, that we need flatness to walk on, and we need buildings of 90-degree angles. There was a wonderful story I read once of people in northern Canada who in the 1920s and 30s got to visit possibly Toronto, I don't know. And years later they were talking to a psychologist, and the psychologist was amazed to find out that they struggled to get through a door. They nowhere in their world ever came across a 90-degree angle. They didn't know what a door was. They couldn't work out that you push this thing open to go through. In their world they did not exist. But in our world they've become commonplace. We don't even think about it. We have imposed that on ourselves. We've shut ourselves in for comfort and heat into rooms that have a bizarre straightness to them, a mundanity. We go on carpet, we go on concrete, we don't put our feet in the earth. We're wearing rubber soles, we're almost divorced from the planet. And this seems to be saying, kick your shoes off, lay on the grass and let the world come inside you and have a journey into Wonderland. And I think that's a really powerful message. I do have issues with the book myself. I've got to get my head around certain things. I think I would like to visit the follow-up through the looking glass just to say I've completed the set. But that's going to be a while down the road. I don't plan to do that at all in the near future. But I'm glad I read it, because I now finally get what I think Carroll was trying to do, Lewis Carroll was trying to do. But for me, the worth is those questions I raised at the time. Would this be accepted today and get printed? What does that tell us? I think I'll be thinking about this one for some time. And not just for the artwork. So, Alice in Wonderland. Have you ever read it? What do you think? Let me know. Ta-ta for now.